Remember, sectionalism means the nation breaking into sections, and then when we talk about sectionalism, we're really referring to north versus south, okay? And all the issues it entails, okay? 1840s immigration, how is it different from 1740s immigration plans, or even 1790s? Most of the immigrants in the late 1830s and 1840s came from Compromise of 1850. So the Mexican War gets over in 1848. Immediately about the time the war ends, they discover gold in California, and by the end of 1849, beginning of 1850, California has acquired 80,000 people, mostly men, mostly from the north. So the president, Taylor, recommends to California that they apply for statehood, which they do. They meet the population requirement. Do they apply as a free or a slave state? Free, because almost all of those 80,000 men came from the north. They don't want slaves, okay? They apply as a free state, and the controversy breaks out. So ultimately, Clay steps up and offers a compromise of 1850, which also is sometimes referred to by the next term, the Omnibus Act. The Omnibus Act and the compromise of 1850 are one and the same thing. The provisions of the compromise of 1850, California will be admitted as a free state. There will be slavery in Washington, D.C., but no slave trade. The border between Texas and New Mexico will be set at what you see now, which is in favor of New Mexico. We will pay Texas's debt to mostly Britain. There will be a stringent slave code act, fugitive slave code act added to this, meaning it will make it easier for Southerners to get back runaway slaves. And in the New Mexico, Utah territories, slavery will be decided by popular sovereignty, which means the people will decide, okay? The Omnibus Act created what? A stronger Fugitive Slave Act, because it's part of the Compromise of 1850. A map of the Compromise of 1850. If they show you a map and it has California on it, that's what it's referring to. It's the Compromise of 1850. Because in between Kansas and California is going to be a blob of territory. And so then you're going to see California. And California in 1850 looks just like California today on the map. So you should be able to recognize it. Personal liberty laws. In response to this new slave act, northern states passed personal liberty laws. Remember that the fugitive slave law made it so that you as a northerner could be forced to help recapture fugitive slaves, that the slave's case or the African American's case would be heard by a judge, no jury. The slave could not testify in his or her behalf, and the judge received $10 if he ruled that you were a slave, and only $5 if he ruled you were a free person. Okay? So anyway, they passed personal liberty laws which said that the state's money could not be used to recapture fugitive slaves, made Southerners really mad. We can't trust you, juries, Northerners, type of thing. Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe made people more aware of the horrors of slavery, made people more abolitionist in nature, okay, more than they had been before. Was her knowledge of slavery based on personal experience? No. It's based on reading articles, hearing people like Sojourner Truth talk about it. Popular sovereignty, the people of a territory or the people of a state determine whether there will be slavery or not. Popular sovereignty is sometimes referred to as the Freeport Doctrine, because the biggest proponent of, or person who advocated for popular sovereignty was Stephen Douglas. And when he was debating Mr. Lincoln for the Senate seat in 1856 or 1858, one of those 2 years, I'll have to look it up. They debated, one of the places they debated was Freeport, Illinois, and Lincoln really went after him about supporting the extension of slavery with popular sovereignty, and Mr. Douglas defended it, so sometimes it's referred to as the Freeport Doctrine. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. Who proposes it? Stephen Douglas. He proposes it because he wants a Northern Pacific Railroad built, and he wants to appease the South by making it easier for them to gain one more slave state. The Kansas-Nebraska Act took the Nebraska Territory, which includes modern-day Kansas, Nebraska, as the code is, and created 2 territories out of it. The southern bottom 1/4 would be Kansas, and the top 3/4 would be Nebraska. His idea was people in this country tend to move very laterally in straight lines east to west. So he assumed that most of the people who settled in Kansas would be coming from Missouri, which was a slave or free state, no, slave state. You remember 1820 Missouri Compromise, slave state. So when they vote in Kansas to set up a territorial government, there were about 1,000 eligible voters, some of whom had moved from Missouri, some of whom had come from New England complements of the New England Immigrant Aid Society, which was a group who encouraged free soilers to move to Kansas, helped pay their way, gave them Beecher's Bibles, which remember were rifles. And when they had the territorial elections, they had about 8,000 people voting instead of just the 1,000 or so that lived there. And the government went ahead and certified the election. Where did all these extra votes come from? Missourians who had come across the border voted and then went back home. Okay. Anyway, what happens is that we end up with the Lecompton crisis and bleeding Kansas. The Lecompton crisis is that the pro-slavery people who win the election set up their government in Lecompton. The anti-slavery people set up their government in Topeka, and bleeding Kansas breaks out where both sides start attacking each other. They sack the city of Lawrence, burn some buildings. Then you get our friend John Brown at Potawatomi Creek, which we'll talk about in a minute. A map of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I have a suspicion that it would be, you would see Kansas, which would be a rectangle, and then above it this big blob of territory all the way to the Canadian border. And that would show you the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Dred Scott case, 1857, I think, but I'd have to look that up. Said 2 things. First and foremost, that blacks, regardless of whether they were slaves or free, were not citizens of the United States and could not sue. And secondly, it said that that's all a moot point anyway because the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Congress never had the right to set a place where there could be no more slavery above that line. Okay? Remember that the head of the Supreme Court when the Dred Scott decision was offered was the Chief Justice was a guy named Roger B. Taney. Remember him, Jackson's friend? He's very much a pro-Southern person. Okay? Southerners received this case with, yay, somebody's finally got it right in Washington. The Northerners were appalled. How did it support the rights of slave owners over slaves? Well, it said slaves had no right to sue and that the government didn't have a right to set where slavery existed or not.